Hello everyone and welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about still lifes and getting your still life set up. So there's a couple things we need to go over before we dive right into the still life. So the first thing we're going to talk about is composition and how composition affects your still life and getting ready for a piece. So, in the visual arts, composition is the placement or arrangement of visual elements, so like objects, anything that you're going to be drawing, or like the ingredients in a work of art. Um, by overlapping your objects and using more objects, you're able to create more depth in a piece. So, a bad still life may have evenly spaced objects, everything's kind of symmetrical, things aren't touching, it kind of looks plain and boring, everything is about the same size, and everything's facing the same way. A good still life has overlapping, there's asymmetry, there's things in groups, there's things touching, stuff is going off the edge of the paper. Things are different heights, there's a variety of objects with different textures, and it's just natural looking. So what we're going to be focusing on when we're setting up the still life is balance, focus, proportion, and contrast. So balance refers to the sense of distribution of the perceived visual weights that offset one another. It gives the viewer the sense that the painting feels right and it's not heavier on one side. The focus or the emphasis of the piece is where the viewer's eye ultimately wants to rest on the most important thing or the focal point in the painting. Otherwise, the eye feels lost and it starts to just wander around. And the contrast, it's a strong difference between light and dark. In addition to the light and dark, contrast can be differences in shapes, color, size, texture, types of line. I know we talked about contrast and value when we were doing shading, so it has kind of a double meaning. So it can be that actual, like, the contrast in the light and dark of the piece, and then as well as like the contrast in objects. And then the last thing we'll talk about is proportion, and how things fit together and relate to each other in terms of size and scale. And that is it. So we're going to turn the camera around and get a still life set up. Okay, so here I have a bunch of objects that I'm going to be using for my still life. I tried to make sure I had objects that had varying heights and shapes and textures. So I'm going to start to set them up so that I'm trying to have balance, focus, contrast, and proportion going on. So the first thing I'm going to do is start to place my taller objects and then place everything around that. Okay, so I think I'm pretty happy with this setup. It's just a small, pretty simple still life. I'm gonna go ahead and switch over so that I can begin the drawing. So I'm just gonna be doing a basic setup of how to do a still life, like setting it up on your paper and getting those initial sketches. So as you can see, I ended up readjusting my still life even more. Now I am going in and lightly planning out where all the objects will be placed on my paper. I'm using very light lines and just focusing on placement and proportion of objects. Once I am happy with the placement and the proportion, then I can go in and begin to break down the objects into basic shapes. I thought this was important to show because I wanted everyone to see that I struggle with getting pieces started just like everyone else. I don't just draw something and have it work out the first time. I make mistakes and I erase a lot. I'm now focusing on creating the groundwork for each object. I take time to look at the basic shapes of each object. So, for example, the cup, I start with a simple oval and then add a slightly larger oval that is the body of the cup. I then add a square shape for the base of the cup and add on the feet. If you are stuck on how to begin drawing an object, just really think about how you can simplify the shapes that make up the object. For the bee, I used a combination of squares and circles and then went back and connected lines, or added curved lines to finalize my drawing. In this transition, I have gone back and refined my drawing even more, so that the objects are now ready to be shaded. I'm now going in and beginning to add value to each object. I recommend starting with a light value for the whole object and then going in and erasing out the highlight or working around areas that you know are the lightest part of the drawing. Then you can add in your darker values. Work slow and have patience with yourself. Oftentimes it takes a few rounds of adding in shading before you have hit a point where your object is finished. I recommend getting a base layer of shading done on every object before going in and adding in the final super dark shading to your piece. This way you can judge where your darkest part of your drawing is and not get stuck if you accidentally made an area darker than it should be. Remember to try to fill your whole page with shading. You don't want to have a lot of white left over, and it's okay for objects to run off of the edge of the paper.